The year was 1992, and comic books were all the rage. The big comic book boom had begun, and it was a great time for any publisher to have control of the Marvel IP. The X-Men were my favorite at the time, and they had that awesome Saturday morning cartoon, so a video game featuring those heroes was a dream come true. So how did they screw it up so badly? Welcome to Risky Bitness. As always, I would like to thank all of my subscribers and everyone who likes and comments on my videos. You guys are the best, and you make doing this worthwhile. A quick side note on the 90s and the comic book boom is that there were a lot of comic book stores for the first time ever. A comic book store was not really a thing up until then, so it was a big boom and a lot of kids were out there collecting comic books. And it's a little bit sad today because you may or may not have heard that Marvel and DC are both on the verge of shutting down all printing of comic books. They're going to just be using their characters for movies and TV shows and merchandise, which is pretty sad. But that's a little bit of a side note. Moving on to the topic at hand, let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Yes, this game was published by LJN. Now, in spite of AVGN's constant running down of LJN, all the games they released aren't fundamentally bad. I'd even go as far as to argue that Jaws and Friday the 13th aren't bad games. Of course, the X-Men game they published for the NES was an absolute abomination, but let's not get too stuck on that little detail. This game was developed by a company called Software Creations, so if we're gonna throw anybody under the bus, it would have to be them. I think the biggest mistake was using a storyline that was already really old. In the 90s, there were all kinds of exciting new Spider-Man and X-Men storylines. The Executioner song comes to mind. But for this game, they chose to use a crossover from 1963 as their source material. The X-Men are still wearing costumes that had been retired for years by the time this game was released, and they still got some of them wrong. These were virtually unrecognizable to fans of the newer comics and cartoon series. It even begs the question, why do a crossover at all, and just not do separate Spider-Man and X-Men games? This is also a very loose adaptation of the comic crossover, with some heroes changed and a bunch of villains added as bosses. In the original 2-issue arc, the evil Arcade kidnaps Cyclops, Colossus, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Banshee, and Storm of the X-Men. Spider-Man witnesses the abduction of Cyclops. He attempts to warn the X-Men, but they are taken as well. In classic comic book fashion, Arcade reveals his sinister plan to the hero. The X-Men are then sent into Arcade's sinister theme park, Murder World. It was the 60s after all. In the game, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Banshee are replaced with Gambit, so I guess that gave the game a little bit of an update, but not quite enough of an update to change Wolverine and Cyclops' wardrobe, I suppose. So is this supposed to be happening in 1963 or 1992? The comic then takes a very different turn, with Colossus turning on the team and adopting a Soviet loyalist persona, which even in 1982 seems a little bit out of date. The Cyclops and Gambit stages that appear in the game don't appear in the comic book at all. Wolverine does appear in the funhouse for a handful of panels, but is quickly joined by the other heroes while Storm is trapped in a room that is quickly filling up with water. Spider-Man's role in the story seems to be secondary, as the X-Men manage to escape from Arcade's theme park without his help. It's really different from what we got in the game. In the game, it seems like Spider-Man is the only hope of the X-Men to escape. It's such a random and odd story to choose, and why this story was chosen out of the long and storied history of both the Spider-Man and X-Men franchises is anybody's guess. I wasn't able to find any info in this whole thing while Googling about this game. According to issue number 122 of Retro Gamer magazine, Richard K. of Software Creations said that there were a lot of problems during the development of the game. This game even cost Software Creations their opportunity to work on the ports of Mortal Kombat, when K refused to cut his family vacation short to address a problem that he states was already being worked on. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find much more on the history of this particular game. It is interesting to wonder if the Mortal Kombat ports might have turned out differently if Software Creations had worked on them. Both ports had their issues, but it would be really interesting if they were both worked on by the same group. Now onto the game itself. You start the game as Spider-Man, playing an incredibly tedious and unnecessarily difficult introductory level. The Spider-Man must go through the stage picking up bombs to disarm them. The bombs must be picked up in order, and your spider sense will point you in the direction of the active bomb. The whole thing results in a mess of backtracking and head scratching, and this was not even in the comic book. What's truly unfortunate here is that this is the best controlling Spider-Man of the 16-bit era. You can climb on walls, swing on your web, and fire web bolts at enemies. You can't swing on your web in mid-air though, so that would have been really great. It didn't really materialize quite the way many of us would have liked. Once you finish this, you arrive at Arcade's Funhouse, where you can select from each of the 5 characters: Spider-Man, Wolverine, Cyclops, Gambit, or Storm. Each character has 2 unique levels. Once the first level is completed, the second level for each character becomes available. You start with 3 lives and have no continues, so if you lose all 3 lives, and you will, you have to do that terrible bomb stage all over again. The difficulty in this game is absolutely ridiculous. This is another shining example of bad difficulty. The kind of difficulty that doesn't present the player with a challenge that can be overcome by hard work and persistence. It's simply frustrating and unrewarding, constantly forcing the player to take damage in order to progress, and creating problems that it's impossible for the player to solve intelligently. Everything in the world is trying to kill you at once, and the levels are fraught with pitfalls. I had to use cheats to get footage for this video. I did the best I could without them, but after a while I gave up on even trying to do it without them. The crazy part is, even with the cheats, this game is still incredibly hard. There are several parts of Gambit's second level where if you go the wrong way, you die, and there's just nothing you can do to get out of it. If you don't know the way before you start the level, you're going to lose a life, and there's just no way to stop it. So even with trial and error, if you choose the wrong path each time you play, choose wrong path 1, choose wrong path 2, and then choose wrong path 3, you lose all your lives. If you finish this game without cheats, let me know in the comment section, and if you have a video, please share it because I really want to see someone master this game. There is a trick, I think, in Gambit's level that you can get unlimited 1-ups, but that's not really what we're here for. You can see that the graphics are okay, but not great, and the sprites, they look mostly like the character they're supposed to be. The villains are a whole other story, and most of them look awful. The controls are pretty good, although sometimes more complicated than they need to be. Wolverine can heal himself by pulling his claws back, which I always thought was cool, and Cyclops can shoot his optic blast in multiple directions. Gambit has limited cards, which can be a big problem. It's totally possible to just run out of cards and find yourself completely defenseless. Of all the game's levels, Storm's is the easiest, because you can heal simply by sticking your head up out of the water. Although, if you were to discharge lightning bolts in that room, I don't think it would play out for Storm quite the way it does here. Wolverine's is probably the best designed level, although the level design throughout it is pretty poor. Throughout the whole game, rather, is pretty poor. Spider-Man's levels are the worst by far. I found myself frequently getting lost or stuck. Gambit's levels scroll, and stopping or not moving fast enough gets you killed, whether it's by a giant ball or by the screen itself. Wolverine's second stage is almost impossible. You have to hit Juggernaut something like 300 times in order to defeat him. I counted. On Cyclops' stage, there seems to be an issue with landing in the minecarts. You die more often than you should because the game just doesn't understand that you're landing there. It's just bad collision detection. This is not a game that any person could ever reasonably expected to actually finish. Each character's levels have a different theme. Wolverine is in a funhouse, Cyclops is in a Genosian mine complete with sentinels, Storm's level is underwater, Gambit's level is based on chess and playing cards, which is, I guess, kind of appropriate to the character. I'm not really sure what chess has to do with his character. And Spider-Man's level theme is fuck you. One shining standout of this game, however, is the soundtrack. It's excellent. It's much better on the SNES than the Genesis, but it's really good on both. You'll hear the tracks in the background of this video. After you complete the first 11 levels, there's a short stage for each character where they run to a transporter before the finale. Storm's sprite looks really bad here, like they didn't even finish it. The final battle with Arcade himself, you take control of Spider-Man, and the X-Men kind of uselessly attack from the sidelines. I know I had some less than kind words to say about this game, and quite frankly it really is not a very good game. However, I did rent it a few times as a kid, and I still play it once in a while. I don't entirely dislike it, it's just much too hard for me to ever expect that I could finish it without cheats. There are also handheld versions of this game for the Game Boy and Game Gear, but I wouldn't even be looking at those because handhelds really aren't my forte, but maybe in the future I'll take a look. Luckily, the SNES would get a redemption with the release of Capcom's excellent Mutant Apocalypse game later on in the life of the console, and Genesis owners had 2 pretty decent X-Men games to choose from as well. Spider-Man got pretty mixed treatment with some of the middling games released on both systems, though there was a pretty great arcade beat-em-up, and Maximum Carnage still seems to get some love. Thanks for watching. If you would like to help the channel grow, please check out the affiliate links in the description. I'll also really appreciate it if you like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Those actions will help my videos show up in more searches and recommendations, so thank you. Until next time, game over.